Okay, I'm going to get started because I know people have other Zoom calls on their agenda and maybe need to carry on after this to do something a little bit more social or fun besides a Zoom call. But in any case, thank you for joining the seminar series, The Brown Bag, today. I'm giving the talk today, and we'll be highlighting some of the key lessons learned from SSHRC partnership grant that we had from 2015 to 2021. So essentially, we're at the end of a large project, Tracking Change. I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory, south of Calgary, and where it's snowing. Very grateful to have the opportunity to connect with you all via Zoom, and looking forward to perhaps some discussion and questions after the presentation. I'll try and move through quickly some of the slides. Some of the students who've taken classes with me may have heard some of the highlights of this before, but I'm basing the presentation off of a publication that we just had accepted called One Size Does Not Fit All, a networked approach to community-based monitoring in large river basins. And you can tell by the author list that it was a very challenging and collaborative process of bringing together different ideas, bringing together Indigenous leaders, elders, as well as academics, including some familiar names perhaps to some of you, including Fickard Burkus. The focal point, or the starting point assumption with our project called Tracking Change, was that the Mackenzie River Basin and other large freshwater ecosystems are under significant stress. That stress is from climate change as well as increasing resource development. The Mackenzie River Basin is one of the largest river basins in the world. It's a major source of fresh water, and the changes that are being seen and experienced across Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon, the jurisdictions that comprise the basin, are being felt acutely by people who live there. The changes including declining fish populations, changing water levels, many different kinds of aquatic ecosystem impacts from development. And I've been working in the Northwest Territories in Alberta for the last 20 plus years. And many of the projects that I've had the honor of being engaged in have been very community-based, or very based in a local place or local environments with a specific nation or community. And over time, there are lots of similarities. I heard many different and similar stories about the impacts of climate change or development across the basin. So the starting point for this project, and the title of the paper, is sort of how do we work together to monitor or track the changes happening in the basin in a way that will contribute to improvements in sustainability and governance. Some of the, I guess, assumptions also, or key starting points for those who aren't as familiar with Indigenous knowledge, is that those who have been living in the basin for many, many generations, Indigenous people, Inuit, First Nations, Métis, are very interconnected with the kinds of changes going on, and the way in which they are impacted is perhaps greater than other populations. This is attributed to the fact that people have a very holistic worldview or social ecological lens in which they understand themselves and the changes going on in the basin. Highly reliant on lands and resources for food security. A great deal of food resources continue to come from the basin, terrestrial and aquatic. And people have identities, spiritual beliefs, and political systems, social organization that are very interwoven with the environment, to a much greater degree, perhaps, than other cultures or other populations. Indigenous people, however, are very diverse. There's a tendency perhaps to understand Indigenous people as homogenous with shared values and norms and very small, very local, perhaps myopic view of what's going on in their environment, but that's kind of a stereotype that we were challenging or confronting with the work that we were doing, that the peoples across the basin are highly diverse with complex cultures that are strongly interconnected to place, but they're also interconnected with each other. Another key starting point is the recognition that Indigenous communities, not only in Canada, but globally are leaders in conservation. They're catalysts of sustainability. Very successful in dealing with issues of environmental degradation and different kinds of threats, particularly where they have rights that are recognized and knowledges that are respected in different forums of decision making. And in Canada, we talk about truth and reconciliation and the process whereby we're addressing social, political, and inequities that exist for Indigenous people. And globally, some of the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People also set that context for recognition of Indigenous rights and knowledges and the value, not only to addressing environmental injustice and social injustice, but working towards other dimensions of social and ecological sustainability. The project Tracking Change is a euphemism for monitoring, or this title, Tracking Change, is a plain language way of talking about monitoring. And the key starting point in the project was also recognition that monitoring is defined sometimes technically or academically, but it really is a systematic process of watching, listening, learning what's going on in your environment. Systematic in the sense that people are looking at the same indicators, using the same methods year after year, season after season. And that's certainly true of so many of the elders and people that I've had a chance to work with over many, many years. And so our starting point is that people are already monitoring. They're already tracking change in very unique and ways that are socially embedded or very integrated in the way in which they live and depend on the environment. So understanding that process of tracking change as something that the rest of Canada or others can learn from was an important starting point. If you're interested, this is I realize my slides are cut off. This is our website, trackingchange.ca, and you can find lots of the details about the project and what we did over the last 6 years. This is a photo of our friend and elder Maurice Nayeli from Delaney. He's a professional photographer. A beautiful number of photos on our website are compliments of Maurice, and we're very grateful for his support, not only of our project and the website with the photos, but also our students. Chelsea Martin, who is a former graduate student, worked closely with Maurice in Delaney on her project about climate change and its impacts on fishing livelihoods in the region. So if you're interested, you can have a look at the website. Very excited about the website. It's been reconfigured with some great creative and passionate work by Tracy Howlett, my colleague Tracy Howlett, and several graduate students who have been working over the last 5 years. The focal point of the work Tracking Change, as I said before, through my experience working with communities, there are a lot of common issues that I was hearing. But in 2015, what we ended up doing was asking partners to get together and decide what, collectively, collaboratively, they wanted to focus on for the research project. There was a lot of concern that the Indigenous knowledge, despite land claim agreements, despite respect for Indigenous knowledge being written into some legislation and into the terms of reference of the Mackenzie River Basin Board, that there still wasn't enough Indigenous knowledge documented to really influence decision making. So there was this inequity to address in the kinds of knowledge that was being used in governance. So the Indigenous governments from across the Northwest Territories and representatives from the other jurisdictions came together and focused on these 3 key areas or priority areas for funding. And that became the basis of the terms of reference that we use to create an RFP or a request for proposals. And the projects were funded based on applications in the years 2016, 17, and 18. And you can see by what's written up here that there's a strong social ecological perspective, a strong focus on environment, but also the social, historical, economic, cultural, political dimensions of that kind of ecological change. We ended up over the 3 years of funding of community projects, funding almost 32 projects across the basin. The size of these dots represent kind of the scale or the area in which people conducted their work. And these are all Indigenous-led projects. It was really exciting to see the proposals come in from different organizations and the extent to which there was a very bottom-up process of design of each of the projects and people coming up with their own priorities that reflected local values and in terms of the research. At the same time, there was this overarching RFP, that list I just showed you, that really guided the organizations in deciding, well, in addition to looking at these local, very, very local or fine scale issues in our region, we're also going to do work to address these larger basin-wide issues. So throughout the project, there is this tension around scale and how to ensure that the work happening very locally was grounded and meaningful and built capacity and address local knowledge needs. At the same time, people bought into the project or wanted to be involved because they were interested in learning or building or contributing to this basin-wide perspective. So this scale issue was a constant challenge. So in the end, the bottom-up design of the program in which people simultaneously looked at their local needs and larger scale or common priorities really was the thread that kept tracking change going over those number of years. And we ended up getting more and more partners wanting to engage over time. And we started with several $1 million from SSHRC, but ended up raising other monies as well from the government of the Northwest Territories and the government of Alberta, as people started to really buy into this model. So rather than having a top-down one size fits all structure and instrument or research tool, that was very much learning from the ground up. And in terms of the paper that we just published, there's different ways of saying, communities were doing their own thing. There is a body of methodological theory called methodological bricolage, which recognizes that this mixed or multi-method approach that recognizes the diversity of knowledges, but also nurtures or catalyzes the development of methods that make sense at the local level is really interesting. So we started playing with this methodological theory of bricolage or methodological bricolage as the basis for talking about the way in which these different methods used in different places knit together. And the conclusion being at the end of the day that one size does not fit all. A diversity of methods, tools, and rules in use for monitoring, although seemingly disjointed, can effectively contribute to building insights about social ecological change that support learning at the local level as well as at basin-wide scales. So some of the indicators, and we're talking about monitoring, we're talking about methods of monitoring, but also, you know, indicators. What are some of the common indicators, sort of from the bottom up? A lot of the signs and signals of change that people ended up focusing on were very similar across the basin, that after the 3 years of funding all these projects, we were able to see, wow, there's an awful lot of focus on, you know, the health of the fish with indicators around like length weight ratio of fish or skinny fish. You know, there's a huge concern about water levels and being able to track changes in flow over time. And that became a very common concern or overarching concern. Other kinds of qualitative indicators: smell of the water, texture of the fish. You know, a lot of the indicators brought together both these quantitative and qualitative perspectives. The kinds of knowledges being that were documented, there's a tendency perhaps to stereotype Indigenous knowledge as narrative, historical, you know, in story form only. But as my colleague Kim Tallbear really highlights, as well as other colleagues I'm working with across Canada, Indigenous scholars, you know, Indigenous knowledge is not just a narrow sort of ethnographic construct. It is knowledge that matters and is created by and of value to Indigenous people. So we saw with the project that different kinds of formats of knowledge were shared, different kinds of tools were developed. On the one hand, we saw the very ethnographic kind of work, storytelling on the land being critical. At the same time, you know, Mackenzie-Great Bear First Nation, for example, developed an app to support navigation of fishers in the Athabasca River, where water levels were highly fluctuating or highly variable, and those fluctuations were leading to safety and other kinds of challenges in travel on the river. Also saw use of participatory video, photo voice, other kinds of social science methods that were used by different partners. So the outcomes or the formats of the knowledge that were shared by the end of the project were also as diverse as the knowledge itself. Just to give you some sense of the projects, there was over 3 years, the Aklavik and Inuvik fish camps, the hunters and trappers organizations in the Inuvik settlement region supported projects in which people gathered knowledge about fish migrations and other aspects of climate change in the region, and used a combination of surveys as well as experiential learning. So you're seeing here an elder setting a net, teaching kids how to set a net and harvest fish, and also cut up or fix the fish for dry fish and consumption in the community. So very strong focus on land-based learning. Not just extracting knowledge and documenting it into a report, but living it in different ways and ensuring that future generations were engaged in that process. Other kinds of knowledges documented or projects, Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta, led by our friend Kevin Akamachi, led a large Placenames project in which over 350 Cree, Dene, and Slavey or beaver names were documented with elders in 4 or 5 different regions of northern Alberta. So really exciting to see that work come together. And at the end of it, what they're doing is creating a website in which that knowledge or those place names will be teaching tools, not only to the public, but also to youth in the school. So that website is under construction right now. We're hoping it'll be done by the end of the year. Another example, the Decho Youth Canoe Trip. Dottie Tetso, who was formerly living in Fort Simpson, and I'm afraid to say, or my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone in Fort Simpson who are being devastated right now as a result of flooding on the Mackenzie River. Heartbreaking to see so many homes and lives affected by the ice jam flood that was created. Lots of property and really just highly disruptive and heartbreaking to see that. This was a picture taken several years ago with youth in which they worked together, and youth were on a canoe trip from Fort Simpson further north on the river, and learned about different sacred sites, cultural sites, but also how the landscape was changing. And it's hard to tell from this photo, but in the background, there's a huge slump, which is essentially the permafrost in the area is melting, and that's causing essentially collapse of that forest floor, creating kind of these odd little lakes and eroded areas that are sloppy and dangerous when traveling. A few other examples, this project from Flutsalgadena First Nation, another canoe trip as well, where the kids were involved in ground truthing, or essentially the elders, Madeline Drybone in the top right-hand corner from Flutsalga and Joseph Catholic, identified key sites on a map of concern or interest, and wanted essentially the kids to go out and check on these sites. And from that, we've had this really interesting baseline of understanding of place from the elders, and then kind of more contemporary observations from youth in those environments. So many projects over those number of years. And as I said, it was a very bottom-up design, but at the end of the day, there were common approaches, common indicators that were used, and we can kind of see that commonality rather than dictating at the front end that everybody should look at certain kinds of indicators. You know, we learned from this process, you know, what were the common indicators or signs of signals of change. So these are just some sort of synthesis of the common methods. Strong focus, as I said, on knowledge and capacity building or strengthening capacity, but really a diversity of ideas about social and ecological change and different ways of thinking about how those matter. The key point at the end of the day was also that this knowledge wasn't just going to sit on a shelf, but had to contribute in some way to learning. So the last column in this table really highlights you know, how knowledge documented through this process of tracking change contributed to local level learning, but also contributed to decision making or forms of decision making at basin-wide or regional scale. So for example, the government of the Northwest Territories has been a big supporter of tracking change. They have a number of policies and initiatives, including the NWT Water Stewardship Strategy and the Aboriginal Steering Committee that really take the principles of listening to or respecting Indigenous knowledge very seriously. And so we're seeing lots of different ways in which you know, the government of the Northwest Territories, the management systems that are in place at the local level, at the regional level, are really able to draw on some of this data and knowledge. At the same time, you know, we see other jurisdictions like Saskatchewan and Alberta where that's not the case. So it's politically diverse what's happening in the basin, and important to recognize, if we say Indigenous knowledge is not being recognized by government, there's a whole sort of complexity to that statement. And, it's certainly true in the Sahtu region of the NWT that Indigenous knowledge is considered, not necessarily the case in northern Saskatchewan or in northern British Columbia. So important to recognize this question of respect for Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights, very carefully in the basin, because there is such a diversity of political institutions. And the Inuvik on in the far north, which are the furthest downstream jurisdiction, have had a land claim settled and institutions of co-management established for over 30 years. Here in Alberta, we're still seeing, the government fight against recognition of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights. So it's a very different kind of political landscape. Just to, I guess, another few photos to highlight some of the fun ways in which outcomes from the project are being mobilized. I'm slow usually to publish for lots of different reasons, but one of which is that we really try to focus on outputs from the project that might be immediately valuable locally, or plain language materials, other kinds of knowledge mobilization work, rather than simply academic publication. So here's an example. I had many graduate students funded through the project, and we just published a special issue of the journal Sustainability, in which you can see, Neil Spicer, Chelsea Martin, Sydney Stenekis, all of their great publications, their work in that peer-reviewed journal. And I think we had close to 27 PhD and master students from Canada, and our sister projects in Thailand and Brazil. But there were other opportunities, mainly focused on high school students. There's a couple photos here of the Youth Knowledge Fair that we held in 2000, and I'm going to forget the dates now, 2016 and 2018. And wonderful photo of a young man from, and I'll remember his name in a minute, from northern Saskatchewan, from Fond du Lac, talking about the sustainability of the Athabasca. He's being filmed there by Global News. We had that Youth Knowledge Fair here at the University of Alberta. At the bottom is a photo of some of the young people who attended the Knowledge Fair in 2018. We sent 6 or 7 of them, had some funding to send them with some graduate students to present their posters, their work at the COP24 meetings in Katowice, the climate change meetings. And that was the same meeting that Greta Thunberg made a huge statement. So it's a really exciting time for them to be there and have their voices heard. So again, rather than the academics always talking and producing papers, we were trying to create opportunities for the kids themselves to tell their stories. And here are also really excited Abby D'Souza, my former graduate student, Carrie Karsgaard, Tracy Howlett worked tirelessly for many months to develop some curriculum materials for grade 7 to 10 high school. So on our website, you can see Tracking Change in the Classroom. There's a number of curriculum documents there and some other cool things there for kids. And this is a picture of my friend Cleo REES from Fort McMurray First Nation. And we also had cross-cultural learning opportunities across the basin. So people having the chance to learn directly from other communities, and that happened within the basin here itself. But also this was a chance for, in this case, Cleo and others. There's our PhD student from University of Wisconsin-Madison in the back to meet with villages and elders from the Mekong River, where hydroelectric development was similarly affecting their livelihoods, their fishing livelihoods. This is a picture of Chief Felix Lockhart and Chief Ernest Bitsina from the Northwest Territories, 2 different nations, and Melody Lepine, who is a well-known activist and leader from Mikisew Cree First Nation. If you've ever had the chance to listen to Melody speak, it's a great opportunity. And this was a meeting that we had in Thailand, but we also went to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York in 2018. And I meant to put a photo of that in there. Or was it 2019, we went to New York to the UN, certainly pre-pandemic. And so those memories of Indigenous elders and leaders presenting at the UN and the opportunity they had to learn and speak to a global audience was exciting. So just to close, and I'm probably way over time, but just to close and reflect back on some of the key themes that I introduced early on and that are highlighted in our publication. The bottom-up approach in which we're really nurturing and seeking to learn from the best practices and methods of local organizations who are on the ground, boots on the ground, boats in the water. You know, they're the people that on a day-to-day basis see and experience, you know, changes in water levels, you know, variability in fish health or in diversity, invasive species entering the basin. They're the people on the ground that we most need to listen to. So they were in the driver's seat with the project and really defining what kinds of indicators and methods were important to them. And at the same time, really were interested in and became part of the Track and Change project because they were interested in this basin-wide perspective. So again, this tension between scales or across scales was key. So this is a bit of our how-to in terms of the methodological bricolage, how to design a project from that bottom-up perspective that leads to, at the end of the day, large watershed or basin-wide kind of perspective. So it very much starts at the bottom by co-designing together what are the common themes, the common approaches that people might be interested in, sort of laying that foundation, then supporting self-determination of organizations to do their own thing, to meet local needs. Throughout the project, capacity building and supporting knowledge sharing between communities was key. Also, capacity building in the sense that some partners didn't have the kinds of institutional capacity that, for example, the Inuvik have, having had a land claim settled and co-management boards established for the last 30 years. You know, in other parts of the basin, like northern Saskatchewan, you know, they see far fewer researchers and also have far less in the way of institutional capacity. So part of our intention with the project was also to strengthen capacity and do that in a way that was through community to community knowledge sharing, but also graduate students played a key role in that as well. So that networking aspect really helped people build sort of their own understanding of what are the larger scale or basin-wide issues. And we know from those of us in sociology that change is normative, or when you're talking about climate change or ecosystem change, that we can try and measure that objectively, but ultimately there's a high degree of subjectivity or inherent subjectivities in how we understand watershed change or social ecological change. And so having opportunities for the leads of the community projects to tell their own story about basin-wide change. And my story of what's important in the basin may be different from someone else's story and someone else's story. So there's an interpretation of the and a meaning making that happens over time as well. that there's not this kind of, again, one size fits all or simplistic interpretation of the outcomes of the project at that larger scale. So we're aiming to continue to support that kind of learning over time. Creating our website is open access with digital platforms for sharing video, the continued monitoring outcomes that people produce, as well as other kinds of learning tools like the curriculum that I shared. So in closing, there are some key lessons learned about the need to support communities and self-determination, that if we're thinking about a networked approach to monitoring in large watersheds or other larger and complex kinds of ecosystems, whether that's a barren ground caribou range or another kind of complex multi-scale kind of ecosystem, that supporting communities in the self-determination to design their own kind of monitoring from the bottom up can be very successful. Not to say that top-down and highly centralized monitoring, that there's no room for that, but this is another approach that may complement other kinds of centralized or scientific monitoring. And I highlighted many of these themes already, but just the value of communities talking to one another, that there's currently a lack of, with conventional kinds of monitoring, there's a lack of fit between who's producing the knowledge on the one hand and who needs it on the other. And sometimes that process of data collection and use of data really is excluding people at the local level. So by local people doing their own monitoring and sharing outcomes of that with other local people, there's a high degree of social learning that can happen on a day-to-day basis that is immediate. Some of the other key learnings, just the importance of respecting intellectual property rights, and the degree of social networking that can happen. Just the recognition that, yeah, monitoring at larger scales is really about this kind of networking piece, and there's lots of further research that can be done around social networking, trust building, and why that matters in monitoring. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and I'm wondering if anyone has any questions. And a big thank you to everyone that has been involved in Tracking Change. We have, the project was guided by a wonderful elders committee of the Mackenzie River Basin Board, Leon Andrew, elder from Norman Wells, Chief Joe Tassani from Prince Albert Grand Council, Cleo Reese from Fort McMurray First Nation, and other really important elders who have guided the process, from day one proposal development right to these closing kinds of outputs from the project. So thanks to them especially. Questions, anyone? I apologize to Con and Andrea, or Lindsay, who I think have seen many variations of this same presentation.
Hi, Brenda.
Hi.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
Please do.
So ultimately, you did this project, you and all the other people involved, as you said, to support the communities in doing and achieving what's important to them. But there is also a role for you, or for the kind of the more academic team in bringing this together. And so I was wondering, on the level of the project, what were your key insights or takeaways that you may also, because you shared with us, I don't know whether I can say that, but you know, there will be future projects. So what will you take away for future projects?
Good question. Thank you, Con. I think, as you know, from having taken the methods class, you know, the strong focus on respecting experts or recognizing experts outside of the university, and really being humbled in the process in terms of what I know and what I don't know. So I learned a lot through working with so many communities about what's really going on, and realize my understanding of the lived experience of Cleo in Fort McMurray, or Leon in Toledo, Northern Wells, that I know sort of just had a glimpse into sort of the insights they have. So I guess, you know, with these larger projects, you know, being humbled by all of the knowledge that exists in the universities, but definitely outside of universities. And I would think most of my graduate students would say the same, that they learn more than the communities did from them. I guess the other key thing is that, you know, as these larger projects are developed, you know, there may be a tendency to think, oh my gosh, I have to be more controlling, I have to be more engineering about all of these different pieces, otherwise it's all going to fall apart. But trusting the process and trusting, you know, the way, you know, the complexity or the diversity in which people want to engage, and not over engineering and overthinking things is I think key. And that may be true, you know, for graduate students who are working on their projects too, with different collaborative partners, that you know, a little bit go with the flow in terms of what makes sense on the ground, and that can be, you know, be a valuable principle, not only for your thesis, but life in general. I mean, what else are we going to do in a pandemic but go with the flow?
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So this type of project, really large scale, working with communities, really communities being in a way part of the project on equal footing. I mean, everyone does what they can contribute, or everyone contributes what they can. But are these projects common around the world? Are there more? Is this a kind of a novel or unique approach?
I'd like to say, well, I'll say I'm not sure, because it's hard to sort of from the outside in kind of seeing the kind of projects or work that might be going on in Scandinavia or you know, Zambia or Australia. Certainly community-based monitoring is becoming more and more popular or supported and recognized. Guardian programs led by Indigenous peoples right across the country are really exciting. My colleague Val Courtois from the Innu Nation, very incredible person to you know, and is leading a huge network of Guardian programs. So there are examples over the last 20, 30 years that have development. The Haida Watchman, for example, on the West Coast, supported by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Another kind of example of monitoring or tracking change, or engaging in learning about the environment in ways that can contribute to sustainability. At the same time, you know, having done a fair bit of research on models and methods for monitoring, I think, you know, there's not a lot of, you know, academically consideration of community-based monitoring, how it works across scales. And so the tendency to think community-based monitoring is just this local thing that happens in a 10 square kilometer area and people produce data. you know, or people get involved in stewarding lands and resources, you know, is more common than kind of this networked approach and really thinking about networks and how that matters to monitoring. So I think there's more and more examples of community-based monitoring and citizen science and this democratization of knowledge, and that's really exciting to start to see, you know, the walls fall down between disciplines, between institutions, universities, and communities. And at the same time, you know, I think there's some work to do to think about, you know, not only how we link Indigenous knowledge and science together, or think about complex knowledges, but also how multiple stakeholders or multiple institutions, you know, how knowledge can be knit together and design work done at the front end versus trying to slap it all together at the end with a stapler. So very long answer to your short question. Thanks, Con. Oh, and I think Kira had a question about understanding and respect of Indigenous knowledge in science-oriented institution. I think that's a great question, Kira. And, you know, just looking at the University of Alberta and some of the things that are being done here, you know, are really exciting and inspiring. My colleague Florence Glanfield, you know, in the Provost's office has a number of initiatives across the institution to support recognition of Indigenous knowledge. The AILS, the Faculty of AILS has been doing a number of things. The new Dean of Science is very committed also to Indigenous hires in positions at the university, and looking at, you know, greater inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in curriculum. So in our department, John Parkins and Kelsey Dokes Jansen and several others were working with the faculty to develop a new course and support greater recognition of Indigenous knowledge across curriculum, for example, in environment and conservation sciences, which some of you are in, or many of you come from that program in our graduate program. So that's something I think that we can kind of look close to home at what we're doing here, and certainly your voice in saying to the faculty or the university that you'd like to see more recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights in curriculum, in process, and you know, would go a long way to supporting some of the people like Florence Glanfield or the Dean, et cetera, in trying to move that direction. Oh, do you want to, Lindsay, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I do. Sorry for the non-videoing. My internet is always slow. I'm still thinking about my MA kind of capstone paper this summer, so I'm always gleaning as much from you as I can. And thinking about how at the federal level, there's, you know, the ICE report and the kind of encouragement, I know it's not perfect, but for more Indigenous protected conservation areas. And then just hearing you say, like in the province of Alberta, there's still real hesitancy to kind of go that direction, it would seem. So I was just gonna ask, like, have you seen any signs of hope or examples in Alberta kind of moving towards more Indigenous-led conservation projects?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I said that about the inequity of looking at what's going on in the Inuvik settlement region and here, because there is such a difference in terms of recognition of rights, certainly by the current government, the sitting government in Alberta. At the same time, you have extremely talented and extremely fierce people like Melody Lapine, who worked tirelessly to negotiate and the creation of an Indigenous protected area with Mikisew Cree First Nation and Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. Colleagues in Cold Lake First Nation, where Carter Grzitza is now working, you know, also fierce and hardworking in terms of finding those points of leverage that can lead to improved land and resource management. So, you know, there are lots of signs of hope, but they're not sort of passively arriving, and it's essentially this sifting through of opportunities that exist, and certainly, you know, UNDRIP and recognition of Indigenous rights federally, you know, as a result of the Liberal government's efforts, you know, imperfect as they are, you know, are certainly a great deal better than what we were looking at before, and certainly, you know, there are wonderful people in government that do a lot of work inside as well to honor their relationships with different nations, you know, despite the political climate of the time. So saying, you know, the government of Alberta is all bad is certainly not true. So I think there's lots of signs of hope, and you know, from yeah, we should chat, and I know I owe you a phone call. Just the idea that you know, the community partners that we're working with through this other grant on cooperative management are really interested in graduate students who could help them find some more points of leverage, like what are best practices of, you know, for governing an Indigenous-led protected area? What are some models that work, say, in, you know, Mi'kmaq territory, or in, you know, Labrador, or in Brazil, that, you know, or what are some principles that could be held up as examples from elsewhere, so that people aren't, you know, building these institutions in the dark. And any sort of extra grad student time or legwork that can go towards that would be great. And I think, you know, that could be a fun project for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I'll send you another email, like,
yes,
in
please
July
do.
or something.
Please do. Yeah, thanks.
Thank
And I
you.
think, thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for your patience also. I think Andrea had another question also. Andrea. Talking about deliverables that are useful, creating opportunities for sharing findings in an accessible way that can be impactful. Well, kind of my answer to Lindsay is one very simple answer to that question, which is, you know, people have oftentimes, you know, with these scenarios, you know, people are run off their feet, right? And they don't have enough time and resources to address the needs that exist, or knowledge gaps, or, you know, need particular kinds of tools or reports that can really fill a gap in the work that they're doing, or to sort of help contribute towards the journey they're on towards an Indigenous protected area, etc. So, you know, the easy answer to that question is deliverables that really fit into that, you know, really address a need that they already identified. So it's a bit of a planning thing at the front end. What is the need that you can fill? And, you know, once you produce the report, because the community told you they needed it, then they'll want it. So it becomes, you know, a self-fulfilling prophecy, what becomes useful. At the same time, there's lots of really interesting work that you are all doing, and including you, Andrea, on renewable energy or other issues that, you know, maybe people haven't had a chance to really dig into or deep dive into. So, you know, as you know from the class we had together, you know, plain language summaries, nobody's going to read your thesis, I'm sorry to say. Finding ways to make that work that you did meaningful and tying it to the sort of very specific realities of what's going on in a particular place or with a particular nation, and keeping it from being too abstract and here's some general ideas, but thinking through how can you make those insights from your research really live and breathe in that context. And I think that sort of extra level of analysis or extra level of interpretation is often something we don't have time for. You guys doing your master's degrees are all overwhelmed. So, it's yet another thing that you're supposed to do. So that would be my answer, but cautiously recommending, given you already have so many priorities and issues that you're working on.
Thanks, Brenda. It's nice to see you and nice to hear about what you're up to.
Great to see you also. Okay, well, it's almost 4 o'clock. Any other questions or comments? And it's a bit self-indulgent for me to talk about this project because it's been such a personal process journey for me and a real wonderful experience over the last few years. So thank you for entertaining my self-indulgent reflections on why it was so fun and so cool. At the same time, there's lots of challenges that I'm still working through in my head. And we just had a call this morning with the Mackenzie River Basin Board, who was a partner on this project. And they would like to see us do even more synthesis towards, what are the key insights that the board or the governments in each of these jurisdictions need to hear. So this is a paper that we published on the methods of tracking change and how, these multiple methods matter. At the same time, our next series of papers, if I am working on those, will be more thematically driven in. So I'm still kind of trying to work through what it all means. And so again, thank you for your time. And also I hope everyone's well and healthy and has been vaccinated or will be vaccinated soon. And we can all be drinking beer at the pub near the university very soon, or something, drinking tea. Thanks, everyone. Stay well.